Discover the surprising biological reason cats became divine guardians in ancient Egypt, far stranger than simply killing rats and snakes.
The ribbon of the Nile stirred to life long before the first rays of sunlight could pierce the thick morning mist that wrapped the valley like a damp linen shroud. Khepri stood ankle-deep in the cool, fertile mud, feeling the river, eternal mother and merciless mistress of their fate, pulse with a rhythm that measured the cycle of life, death, hunger, and abundance for every soul in this settlement. In the pre-dynastic era, an age where every grain of wheat bore the weight of human existence, mourning was not the greeting of a new day, but the resumption of an endless struggle for survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. The air reeked of river silt, rotting papyrus reeds, and the pervasive dry dust blown in by winds from the western desert. A constant reminder of how narrow the strip of life was that separated them from absolute annihilation. Along the riverbanks, in the slowly brightening light of a horizon shifting from deep indigo to shades of blood ochre and terracotta, the silhouettes of other farmers took shape. They moved with an almost ritualistic slowness, stooped beneath the weight of their tools, skin gleaming with sweat and moisture, linen loincloths stiff with dried mud. Khepri tightened his grip on his wooden hoe, its shaft worn smooth by generations of calloused hands. The water churned around his legs as a flock of ibises pressed skyward with a thunderous clap of wings, cutting across the golden disk of the sun, just emerging above the eastern dunes. This was a world without mercy, a world where the labor of human hands was the only barrier against the ever-present specter of famine, and every day began with the same silent pact made with the earth and the river. The sun's rays began to sculpt the landscape, drawing the sharp edges of clay huts from the darkness and casting long, dramatic shadows that seemed to crawl across the ground like living things, reminding Khepri that in this ancient world, light and darkness waged a constant, silent war over every inch of space.
As the sun climbed ever higher into the cloudless, pale blue sky, the temperature in the settlement rose at a terrifying pace, turning the air into a shimmering, suffocating mass that warped perspective and sucked every last drop of moisture from every living creature. The village, built of sun-dried mud brick, seemed to vibrate in the infernal heat, its walls the color of parched earth, releasing accumulated warmth to create an atmosphere like the interior of a vast, superheated furnace. Khepri leaned against the rough wall of his dwelling, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a hand whose skin was cracked and hard as tanned crocodile hide. Every breath required effort in this environment, and the smell of the surroundings, a blend of flatbread baking on hot stones, fish drying in the sun, and the sharp stench of animal dung used as fuel, formed a dense, almost palpable suspension. For Khepri and his kinsmen, this brutal reality was the only one they had ever known. There was no room here for romanticizing a nature that could turn against them at any moment, obliterating harvests with drought or a plague of locusts. Life in the pre-dynastic age was a merciless test of endurance, where the smallest mistake, a moment of inattention, or disregard for the forces of nature could mean the death of an entire family. The community functioned as a single complex organism bound by the shared purpose of survival, where individual desires yielded entirely to the necessity of filling the granaries before the coming season, when the Nile would recede and the earth would crack into a sterile, barren shell. In this world, there was no room for weakness, and every inhabitant, from the smallest child to the oldest elder, had a specific, vital role in the endless chain of food production
that formed the absolute foundation of their fragile existence on the edge of the great desert. At the heart of this merciless world, the true temples were not yet monumental stone edifices, but the modest cone-shaped grain silos built from a mixture of mud, straw, and cattle dung, the physical center of the entire settlement's survival. Khepri turned his steps toward these clay structures, his bare feet raising small clouds of reddish dust with each heavy stride, his mind consumed by constant, gnawing calculations of stored provisions. The granaries were everything to them: treasury, life insurance, and the only defense against the inevitably approaching months of scarcity. The texture of the silo walls, rough and riddled with hairline cracks from relentless baking under the Egyptian sun, told the story of many seasons of brutal labor, hope, and fear that had accompanied every harvest. As Khepri approached the largest of the family's granaries, he felt that familiar, unpleasant clench of anxiety in his stomach, one that had never left him since, as a young boy, he had first looked upon the face of a man dying of starvation. The wheat and barley hidden within those dark, stifling interiors was a currency more precious than gold or lapis lazuli. It was the very essence of life, compressed into hard, golden kernels. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the west, casting long, distorted shadows across the granaries that lay on the dusty earth like black, slender fingers, reaching to claim what the farmers had wrested with such terrible cost from the river and the soil. In that golden afternoon light, every mote of dust drifting in the air seemed to shimmer with its own inner radiance, creating an atmosphere of intimacy laced with unrelenting tension. A reminder that in this world, no treasure was safe without vigilant, ruthless protection. The moment Khepri drew aside the heavy reed-woven cover securing the lower inspection port of the granary became the turning point of that sweltering day, transforming a routine inspection into a blood-chilling discovery. A sharp, ammoniac stench struck his nostrils at once, cutting through the smell of dry grain and clay, a smell that signified only one thing: rats. His heart hammering wildly, Khepri thrust his hand into the darkness, and when he withdrew a fistful of wheat, his worst fears became a brutal reality. In the afternoon light, he saw that many of the grains were gnawed and damaged, with the characteristic dark droppings of vermin scattered among them. Droppings that to a farmer were the unmistakable herald of approaching catastrophe. In an era without any advanced method of chemical pest control, a plague of rodents in the granary could, within a few weeks, reduce months of murderous family labor to nothing, condemning them to slow and agonizing death by starvation. Khepri felt a cold sweat run down his back, despite the all-encompassing heat, and terrible visions began forming in his mind. Empty millstones and children crying with hunger in the coming season when the river would narrow to a trickle and the earth would yield no harvest. These small, voracious creatures lurking in the darkness were an enemy as lethal as hostile desert tribes, and the struggle against them was not a matter of convenience, but the most elemental fight for the biological survival of the human species in the Nile Valley. Khepri stared at the ruined grain, feeling helpless rage mingled with blind panic, while the deep, claustrophobic darkness of the granary seemed at that moment to throb with hidden, destructive life, devouring the foundations of their existence from within.
It was at this precise moment of bottomless despair and helplessness that Miut emerged from the deep shadow cast by the neighboring mud brick wall, moving with a soundless fluidity that seemed to defy the very laws of gravity. She was no soft, domesticated pet from some later age corrupted by luxury, but a wild, predatory African wildcat, a lean, muscular killing machine honed by unforgiving nature for the environment in which she lived.
Her coat, the color of sun-bleached grass and sand, dappled with subtler dark stripes, provided perfect camouflage in this world dominated by ochre and terracotta, rendering her almost invisible until she chose to be seen. Khepri looked at her, and in her large, emerald-green eyes, he saw a reflection of the same ruthless logic of survival that governed his own life. No warmth, no affection, only the cold, calculating intelligence of a hunter at the apex of its local food chain. Mute was a living weapon, a silent partner in the endless war to secure resources, and her presence in the compound was tolerated and valued not for her charm, but solely for her unmatched effectiveness at exterminating vermin. Her lithe, elongated body moved close to the baked earth, every muscle beneath her skin working with mechanical precision, while her long triangular ears, tipped with tiny tufts, swiveled like sensitive radar dishes, capturing the faintest sounds from within the infested granary. In this relationship between human and animal, there was no room for sentiment. Khepri provided her with safe refuge on the settlement's edge and access to the richest concentrations of prey. She, in return, mercilessly eliminated the threat, becoming the unseen guardian of their lives and their future.
Khepri stepped back, yielding the initiative to Mute, watching with a mixture of relief and deep admiration as the predator shifted into a state of total, murderous focus before the open mouth of the dark silo. The cat froze utterly still, transforming into a living statue sculpted from sand and shadow, her tail stretched flat behind her as counterbalance to a body coiled to its absolute limit, ready to release kinetic energy in a fraction of a second. Then, with a speed the human eye could barely follow, Mute plunged into the void of the granary, and the silence of the summer afternoon was shattered by a brief, panicked squeal, followed by the muffled sounds of a struggle inside the clay structure. The battle in complete darkness, amid hundreds of thousands of wheat grains, lasted barely a heartbeat. But for Khepri, who depended on this small predator, it was a moment of absolute triumph of the forces of order over the forces of chaos. Mute did not rely on brute force to dominate her prey. Her technique was the absolute precision with which her razor-sharp claws pinned the quarry, while her jaws clamped with murderous force on the neck of a large, grain-fattened rat, snapping its spine with one faultless movement. This was not play. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was pure biological necessity, executed with a perfection that any human warrior defending his territory might envy. From within the silo came no further sounds, and the dust-laden air was once again dominated by dead silence, broken only by the quiet, barely audible panting of the cat who had just concluded the brutal execution of an enemy, ensuring that at least this one creature would no longer deplete their precious stores.
When Mute emerged back into the sharp, blinding sunlight, her muzzle clamped around the limp, bloodied body of an enormous rat whose size was enough to chill the blood, making Khepri acutely aware of the magnitude of the threat they had been facing. The cat approached the farmer with a quiet, almost proud step, then, without the slightest trace of emotion, dropped the dead rodent directly at his calloused, cracked bare feet, casting him a brief, penetrating glance from her green eyes before sitting down to methodically lick the blood from her front paws. This macabre gift was no expression of love or desire to please. In the primitive logic of those times, it was rather a hard physical proof of work done, confirmation of the animal's usefulness within the human habitat. Khepri looked at the carcass of the pest, feeling a deep, pragmatic gratitude that in future centuries would transform into the divine veneration accorded to the goddess Bastet, but which now was simply a farmer's respect for an effective tool guaranteeing survival. The man bent down, picked up the dead rat by its tail to throw it far from the dwelling, and in his mind arose the awareness that without the help of this silent, shadow-haunting huntress, all their agricultural knowledge and hard labor in the fields would be utterly powerless against the might of nature. Mute did not demand praise, did not wait for caresses after completing her grooming.
She simply rose, stretched her long, supple body, and at an unhurried pace moved along the sun-warmed wall to continue her endless patrol, seeking the next targets for elimination in this daily war for every stalk of grain.
The day began its inexorable descent toward evening, and the Egyptian golden hour flooded the settlement with a thick, almost liquid amber light that lent the harsh clay buildings an impression of extraordinary ethereal sublimity, reminiscent of masterwork paintings in which dust and motes danced in the oblique rays of the sun like particles of pure gold. As the temperature fell, life in the village began to change its rhythm. The loud cries of men working in the fields died away, yielding to quieter domestic sounds, the clatter of stone millstones grinding the last of the old grain, the bleating of goats being driven into their pens, and the crying of children exhausted by the heat. Khepri sat on the threshold of his dwelling, feeling the mud brick warmed throughout the day, now releasing its stored heat to his back, bringing momentary illusory relief, while his eyes carefully tracked the shadows lengthening minute by minute, which like black pools began to devour the space between the houses. The approaching night, with its cool breath off the Nile, was not a time of carefree rest, but a period of the highest vigilance, when the darkness concealed real, lethal dangers, desert predators, venomous insects and reptiles that waited only to crawl from their lairs in search of warmth and food. The shallow depth of vision in the gathering dusk caused the boundaries between reality and imagination to blur, and every dry palm leaf stirred by the wind or creaking papyrus stalk might herald the arrival of unexpected death, reminding the inhabitants of their extraordinary fragility in the face of the powerful cosmos. Khepri knew that in this ancient world, stripped of the gleam of artificial light, darkness was not merely the absence of sun, but an almost physical substance, dense and impenetrable, in which only creatures by nature adapted to nocturnal life could move freely and protect sleeping humans from the encroaching evil. When the last rays of sunlight retreated below the horizon and the sky assumed the color of deep, impenetrable lapis lazuli scattered with millions of sharp white stars, Khepri entered his modest dwelling, in which the only source of light was now a weakly smoldering fire in a clay vessel, producing more acrid smoke than brightness. On the earthen floor, covered with rough mats woven from river reeds, his children already slept, two small, defenseless bodies wrapped in coarse, thin linen sheets, their regular, peaceful breathing the single soothing sound in this claustrophobic, dark space. Watching their sleep, Khepri felt the weight of responsibility crushing his shoulders with the force of a physical burden. In this brutal pre-dynastic world where child mortality was terrifyingly high and disease and predators exacted their cruel toll daily, reaching the next dawn was never guaranteed, only hoped for. The air inside the hut was still stuffy, saturated with the smell of dried mud, human sweat, and ancient dust that seemed to settle on everything, coating every surface with a thin gray layer that recalled the inevitable passing of matter and the fact that all would ultimately return to the same sand on which they now walked. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to thicken, forming disturbing, illusory shapes, and every faint sound from outside caused the farmer to clench his calloused hands, listening tensely, ready at any moment to snap to full alertness and defend his family with a simple copper knife. It was in such moments, in the silence of nocturnal defenselessness, that one felt most acutely the absolute dependence of human life on the whims of nature and the power of invisible forces that at any second might invade this humble sanctuary and destroy everything Khepri loved and protected at such enormous cost.
In the absolute silence of the night, broken only by the steady chirping of crickets hidden in the undergrowth, there suddenly came a sound that in every inhabitant of the Nile Valley instantly awakened atavistic, blood-freezing terror. A quiet, dry rustle of scales sliding against the dried, compacted clay of the floor, approaching with terrifying slowness. From deep shadow, right beside the spot where Hepri's children lay sleeping on their mats, oblivious to all danger, an elongated, starlight-gleaming shape emerged slowly, an Egyptian cobra, the embodiment of silent, crawling death, seeking shelter and warmth in a human dwelling after the cold of the night. Its scales shone like polished onyx, and its movements were utterly without jerk or hesitation, like a flowing stream of dark, lethal venom that with each passing second drew nearer to the exposed foot of the farmer's youngest son, resting at the edge of the woven mat. Hepri, torn from sleep by that ominous rustle, froze in terror, knowing that any sudden movement on his part would provoke the snake to an immediate, deadly strike against which there was no remedy in a world ignorant of anti-serums or advanced medicine. A bite meant agony and certain death before the coming of dawn. The cobra, sensing a change in its environment, slowly raised the front portion of its body and spread its characteristic threatening hood, its cold, lidless eyes scanning the space, while its forked tongue flickered in the air, tasting the fear and sweat of the terrified father, who felt his own heart about to burst his ribcage with helplessness. This was a moment of absolute paralysis, a clash between human desperation and the cold, perfect evolution of a predator that had reigned on the desert for millennia and had now crawled into the very heart of human shelter to claim its dark right to deal death with lightning, irreversible precision.
Before the cobra could deliver its murderous strike, from the darkest corner of the room, with the speed of a lightning bolt, the shadowy, fury-vibrating silhouette of Miut shot forward, placing herself precisely between the deadly reptile and the sleeping, defenseless children. The cat, habitually silent and invisible, transformed in a fraction of a second into the embodiment of primal fury, her back arched in a dramatic, rigid bow, fur standing on end across her entire body, making her appear twice as large and far more terrifying, while from her throat came a low, guttural growl, ascending into a piercing, demonic hiss. In this confrontation, there was no longer any trace of the cautious, calculating rat hunter. Miut was now an undaunted defender of her territory, willing to face death, her emerald eyes blazing in the darkness like two malevolent flames, fixed with absolute determination on the vibrating body of the snake. The cobra hissed furiously and lunged forward, intending to sink its venomous fangs into the body of her adversary, but feline agility proved to be a phenomenon of an entirely different, higher order of nature. Miut leaped sideward with breathtaking elegance, while simultaneously delivering a series of lightning-fast, dazzlingly swift blows with her paw, armed with extended, sharp claws, striking directly at the reptile's head. The battle was brief, but filled with extreme tension and brutal force. It was a spectacle of two of nature's perfect killers, in which the speed and reflexes of the mammal met the lethal instinct and toxicity of the reptile in a mortal dance on the packed earth of the human dwelling. Ultimately, the cobra, stunned by a barrage of precise and painful blows, disoriented and deprived of the ability to deliver an effective strike, folded its hood and with a loud hiss retreated in panic toward the gap in the wall through which it had entered, vanishing back into the darkness of the desert, leaving behind only the scent of dust and unimaginable stress.
Khepri sank to his knees, gasping for air as though he himself had just fought an exhausting mortal battle for the lives of his children, and streams of sweat poured down his face, sweat caused not by the heat,
but by the sudden crash of the massive dose of adrenaline that had been coursing through his veins moments before. With trembling hands, he moved to the sleeping little ones, making certain they had not wakened during this silent nocturnal battle, and that on their dark, smooth skin there were no signs of a bite that in a fraction of a second could have turned this dwelling into a place of eternal grief. Once assured the children were completely safe, his gaze rested on Mute, who after the snake's retreat had immediately returned to her original calm state, as though the confrontation with the embodiment of death had been merely a trivial episode in her night patrol, unworthy of further attention or reflection. The cat sat near the entrance, meticulously licking her front paw, and the only trace of her recent lethal fury was a slightly elevated pulse visible in her slender neck and the restlessly twitching tip of her tail that occasionally struck the packed earth. In that dark, smoky interior, watching this small, seemingly unremarkable creature, Khepri felt for the first time in his pragmatic farmer's life something more than mere appreciation for the animal's usefulness. He felt a kind of deep, religiously tinged respect for a force he did not fully understand, yet which had become the physical barrier between the lives and the death of his own blood. He realized that it was not the thick mud-brick walls, nor his own vigilance that protected them from the darkness, but this silent, green-eyed predator who, in her own animal nature, had found reason to defend this shared territory against intruders from outside with uncompromising, brutal effectiveness.
The following day, as the solar disk began its descent toward the western horizon and the worst heat of the day eased to a bearable level, the village elders gathered in their traditional meeting place beneath the spreading, deeply shadowing boughs of an ancient sycamore whose roots plunged deep into the fertile riverbank. Khepri joined the circle of gray-haired, deeply wrinkled men whose skin resembled old parchment inscribed with the stories of past droughts, great floods, and plagues, and whose wisdom, passed down exclusively by word of mouth in this era not yet acquainted with advanced writing, was the settlement's most important law. The air around them was thick with the smoke of burning herbs and tobacco, blending with the river breeze and the low, guttural murmur of ongoing conversations merged into a soothing sound that counterbalanced the constant tension of daily labor on the land and the fight for survival. They spoke of the approaching harvest, carefully assessing every smallest sign of atmospheric phenomena, groundwater levels, and the quality of the emerging wheat ears, for on these precise calculations depended whether the community would survive another year or be decimated by the inevitable, cruel hunger. Their manner expressed a deep pragmatism rooted in pain and experience. There was no room here for unfounded optimism, and every word spoken by the elders carried the weight of a verdict based on hundreds of years of observing the whims of merciless nature and drawing conclusions from the often tragically consequential errors of their ancestors. In this patriarchal circle, where physical strength was slowly yielding to the authority of intellect and memory, Khepri shared the events of the preceding day, describing coolly, without superfluous emotion, the problem with rats in the main granary and the night's blood-chilling encounter with a deadly cobra in his own home.
The voice of the eldest of the clan, a man whose face was carved with scars and whose eyes were clouded with the cataract of old age, rang out in the thick air, quietly, yet with a force that immediately silenced the rest as he began to analyze the significance of the events Khepri had described in the context of the entire settlement's security. The old man, dressed in a simple, faded linen cloak, slowly nodded his head, emphasizing that the presence of pests in the granaries was not merely a private problem of one family, but the beginning of a plague that, if not immediately suppressed, would spread to all the silos, robbing them of food for the harshest, most barren months. With deep gravity, yet devoid of any mystical exaltation,
the elders began to discourse on the incalculable role played in their lives by the predatory, semi-wild cats they called Mew, treating them not as magical beings to be prayed to, but as living shields, a biological defense mechanism in which the settlement had to invest by offering them space and peace. In this pragmatic discussion, the cat was not a god, but a supremely efficient work tool, more valuable than any weapon fashioned from bronze and wood, because it fought an enemy that a man was incapable of locating or destroying independently in the dense darkness of granaries and cramped huts. The men gathered beneath the sycamore nodded gravely, understanding perfectly the unwritten social contract between species. So long as the Mew guarded their precious grain against the destructive teeth of rats and protected their children from the venom of crawling serpents, the community would tolerate them, respect their territory, and treat them as a key, indispensable element in their complex struggle for survival on the edge of the encroaching desert. It was here, in the dust and grime of daily existence, that the great cultural phenomenon of reverence for the domestic cat was born, a reverence that only millennia later, in the age of the great pharaohs, would evolve into an institutionalized religious cult, but which now was the purest utilitarianism born of fear and wonder in its most unadorned form.
When the gathering ended and Khepri made his slow, weary way back to his dwelling, the horizon beyond the western bank of the Nile was already ablaze with an intense, blood-red glow heralding the arrival of another dark night, full of unknowns and potential threats lurking in the shadows. From a distance, among the shadows cast by the rough walls of the largest clay granary, the farmer caught sight of the familiar slender silhouette of Mute, sitting motionless like a statue carved from ancient stone, her ears directed toward the ever-living, sound-filled darkness of the silo's interior. Her sharp green eyes caught for a fraction of a second the last embers of the dying, setting sun, flashing in the darkness like two precious jewels set amid dust, poverty, and hard daily toil, symbolizing the hidden, mysterious life force of survival. Khepri halted for a moment, feeling the cool evening wind on his sweating skin, and looked at this animal with a perspective altered by the events of the day past. He saw in her the ultimate ally in a world that ceaselessly strove to destroy the work of human hands, the silent guardian holding the fragile line between life and death by starvation. She was no goddess to whom he would offer prayers, no deity from the pantheon of great natural forces. Yet in that moment, in that specific place and time, standing guard over every crumb of food, her role for the settlement was infinitely more important and tangible than any vague, distant promise of life after death. Then Mute, soundlessly, like a spirit born from sand and wind, vanished into the dense darkness of the granary, beginning her night shift as a hunter, to ensure once more with her skill, speed, and merciless killer instinct that Khepri and his family would awaken the following morning to continue their own human struggle in the boundless, sun-scorched Nile Valley. Chapter 2. The Fading of the Sun.
The established rhythm of life within the small mud-brick compound, a rhythm dictated for decades by the unfailing rise and fall of the sun god Ra, had been fundamentally and perhaps irrevocably disrupted. The air itself seemed to have thickened, no longer the crisp, dry breath of the desert morning, but a stagnant, heavy medium that pressed down upon the inhabitants with the weight of unhewn stone. At the center of this suffocating atmosphere was Khepri's grandfather, the unquestioned patriarch and the deeply respected elder whose very voice had once commanded the respect of the entire village. He had fallen gravely ill, struck down not by a sudden wound of the flesh, but by a creeping, insidious weakness that seemed to siphon the very vitality from his bones. His decline was not a dramatic collapse, but rather a slow, inexorable fading, a gentle yet terrifying dimming of an internal light that cast a long psychological pall over the entire household. The once sturdy walls of the home, usually a sanctuary of bustling activity, laughter, and the rhythmic grinding of grain, now felt like the interior of a sealed tomb, holding in the heat and the palpable fear of the family. The golden hour of the Egyptian sun, usually a time of vibrant, warm shadows and a reprieve from the midday wrath, now merely served to highlight the dancing dust motes that hung motionless in the stifling air, each particle a testament to the stagnation that had taken root in the home. The visual reality of the space shifted, becoming a hyper-realistic tableau of despair. The rough, abrasive grain of the sandstone walls, the delicate, brittle fibers of the rolled papyrus scrolls, and the worn, sweat-stained linen of the family's garments all seemed to stand out in sharp, agonizing relief against the impending tragedy.
The patriarch, a man whose hands had once been as strong as the ropes used to haul limestone blocks, now lay bedridden in the deepest, coolest alcove of the house, a space that was rapidly transforming from a place of rest into a vestibule for the afterlife. His breath, which used to boom with the resonance of a deeply hollowed drum, had been reduced to a shallow, wet rasp, a terrible sound that echoed through the quiet house and marked the relentless passage of time. His skin, once a rich, sun-baked terracotta, had grown papery and translucent, stretched painfully tight over his skull and cheekbones, revealing the fragile, intricate architecture of the mortality that bound him. The family, consumed by a desperate, frantic helplessness, hovered around the periphery of his sickbed, their faces etched with deep lines of exhaustion and sorrow. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, an illness of this magnitude was never merely a failure of the flesh, a simple mechanical breakdown of the body's functions. It was fundamentally a profound spiritual crisis, a cosmic imbalance taking place on a microscopic scale. The physical body, the cot, was merely a temporary vessel, a clay jar baked in the sun, meant to house the divine, eternal soul, the Ba. What the family was witnessing, with growing, silent horror, was the agonizing, slow unmooring of the Ba from its failing earthly anchor. They visualized his soul as a small, human-headed bird, fluttering frantically against the deteriorating cage of his ribs, desperate to take flight toward the eternal reeds, yet still bound by the lingering, fraying threads of mortal life. This terrifying spiritual transition charged the atmosphere of the small mud brick home with an almost electric sense of dread, turning every mundane occurrence into a potential message from the divine. The family, steeped in generations of deeply ingrained religious superstitions, began to see omens in every shifting shadow cast by the flickering oil lamps, and they heard whispered prophecies in the dry rustling of the palm fronds outside their narrow windows. In a desperate bid to tether the old man's soul to the living world, the women of the household resorted to a frantic array of traditional remedies and fervent prayers, transforming the domestic space into a makeshift apothecary and shrine. The air grew thick and heavy with the pungent, overwhelming scents of crushed garlic, bitter myrrh, and burning frankincense. Ingredients ground furiously in heavy basalt mortars in the hopes of driving away the malevolent spirits that were believed to be feasting on the elder's life force. Small, hastily crafted offerings of fresh honey, warm bread, and precious beer were placed trembling before the household shrines, dedicated to the fierce protective deities like Bes, the grotesque but benevolent dwarf god, and Taweret, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess who guarded the thresholds of life and death.
The flickering golden light of the castor oil lamps cast long, monstrous dancing shadows against the ochre walls, illuminating the tear-streaked faces of the family members as they chanted ancient incantations, their voices a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Yet, despite the smoke, the prayers, and the pungent poultices applied to the dying man's chest, nothing seemed to halt the inexorable fading of his internal sun. The remedies sat useless, the offerings remained untouched by the divine, and the crushing sense of impending loss only deepened. It was during this agonizing period of spiritual and emotional siege that Khepri, the young boy whose world had been turned upside down, noticed a subtle but highly distinct, almost chilling change in the behavior of the household's most enigmatic resident, Mute, the feral Egyptian Mao. For as long as Khepri could remember, Mute had been a creature of the periphery, an aloof, merciless hunter of the shadows who only sought human contact when she required the warmth of the hearth during the brief, biting desert winters, or when she demanded scraps of fish from the day's catch.
She was the undisputed warden of the family's vital grain stores, spending her nights in relentless, violent patrol of the dark Granary, a silent assassin keeping the encroaching desert rodents at bay. Her morning routine was a macabre display of her efficiency. Khepri was accustomed to waiting up and finding the grisly trophies of her nocturnal hunts: mutilated rats, severed scorpion tails, and crushed beetles, laid out with deliberate, chilling precision on the rough sandstone of the front doorstep. But as the grandfather's condition worsened, as the scent of decay and medicinal herbs overpowered the smell of baking bread, the morning doorstep remained entirely, eerily bare, devoid of the blood and fur that usually marked the boundary of the cat's violent domain. Khepri, tasked with the mundane chores that felt utterly meaningless in the face of his grandfather's dying, walked past the silent, unguarded granary and felt a profound, unsettling shift in the natural order of his universe. He realized, with a dawning sense of confusion and unease, that Mute had completely abandoned her lifelong post, forsaking the hunting grounds that defined her very existence, to retreat entirely into the suffocating, grief-stricken interior of the house. Her focus, usually turned outward toward the rustling dangers of the dark desert edge, had shifted entirely inward, pulling her toward the magnetic epicenter of the impending tragedy, the stifling, shadowed room where the old man lay struggling for his final breaths. She was no longer the feral guardian of the grain. Her sleek, muscular body, covered in fur the color of bruised desert bronze, now moved with a slow, deliberate, and deeply unnerving purpose through the dusty corridors of the home. Khepri found her, eventually, sitting with statuesque rigidity exactly at the threshold of his grandfather's room, her posture eerily mirroring the sacred, stylized carvings of the goddess Bastet that adorned the grand temples in the distant, bustling cities. She sat perfectly still in a singular, dramatic shaft of late afternoon sunlight that pierced the gloom, the dust motes swirling around her unblinking form like a halo of chaotic, microscopic stars against the deep terracotta shadows. Her striking, luminous, golden-green eyes were locked with unwavering, terrifying intensity onto the frail form of the dying patriarch, entirely ignoring the frantic, weeping movements of the women and the pungent smoke of the protective fires. Khepri, desperate for any semblance of normalcy, for any anchor to the life they had known before the sickness descended, foolishly attempted to break the cat's supernatural trance and lure her back to the world of the living. He rushed to the kitchen area and retrieved a prime piece of freshly caught Nile tilapia, its silvery scales glistening with river water, the rich, pungent smell of the flesh, usually enough to send Mute into a frenzy of demanding vocalizations.
He crept slowly toward the threshold, his small feet silent on the woven papyrus mats, and knelt beside the statuesque feline, extending the small clay dish holding the fish, the Nile blue accents of his kilt catching the dim light. But Mute did not so much as twitch a single sensitive whisker. Her ears remained pinned slightly back, attuned not to the rustle of the boy or the smell of the food, but to a frequency of existence entirely alien to Khepri's mortal senses. She completely ignored the offering, her gaze penetrating the thick, shadowy gloom of the sick room, seemingly watching the invisible, silent struggle of the grandfather's Ba as it fought to untangle itself from the dying flesh. Looking at the cat's rigid, unyielding profile, Khepri felt a cold, sharp shiver of profound dread travel down his spine, realizing with the innate intuition of a child that Mute was not standing guard over the man's body, but was vigilantly waiting to escort his soul into the terrifying, unknown vastness of the dark.
Chapter 3. The Unbidden Vigil. The air in the grandfather's cramped chamber had grown thick, almost suffocating, saturated with the heavy, sweetish smell of slow decay that mingled with the aroma of burning, dried medicinal herbs, desperately trying to cheat the inevitability of fate, and the ubiquitous, all-pervading dust blown in by dry winds from the western desert. In this claustrophobic half-light, where every single ray of the setting sun, forcing its way through the narrow cracks in the clay walls, exposed millions of slowly dancing dust motes, Mute appeared like a spectre woven from elongated shadows. She did not enter the room as an ordinary domestic animal. She flowed across the threshold, setting her soft paws soundlessly on the packed earthen floor, as though gravity did not apply to her and the laws of physics ceased to function in the face of approaching death. Her slender, elegant silhouette, outlined by a delicate, vibrating aureole of golden light, seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness, becoming the sole clear point in the fading world of the old man. She passed with complete indifference the scattered clay bowls of half-eaten dried food, ignored the feverish, quiet prayers of Khepri's mother kneeling in the corner, and unerringly directed herself straight toward the low pallet of faded, rough linen and reed mats. There, at the very feet of the dying man, where his emaciated legs, resembling dry branches barely registered beneath the heavy cloth, the cat froze in absolute statue-like stillness. She was not seeking the physical warmth that the failing body could no longer offer, nor was she asking for scraps of food or caresses. She became a silent, impassive sentinel whose sudden, wordless presence instantly changed the energetic structure of the entire dwelling, introducing into it an element of something supremely primal, untamed, and absolutely beyond question. Her fur, smooth as polished river stones, gleamed in the scant russet light, and her entire posture expressed an ultimate, inexplicable readiness, as though her appearance in this specific place and time were the result of an ancient cosmic pact that mortal men had long and irretrievably forgotten, yet which now, in the face of a soul's passage, demanded its absolute fulfillment. Khepri's mother, a woman with hands hardened by daily, hours-long kneading of bread dough and a face deeply furrowed with the wrinkles of constant worry, was the first to mount a desperate, instinctive fight against this uninvited, silent visitor. In her eyes, filled with panicked fear and age-old superstitions, the presence of an animal at so critical a moment was an omen of misfortune, something unclean that might disturb the peaceful journey of the old man's soul to the field of reeds, or perhaps even constitute a physical manifestation of a demon hungering for the last life-giving breath. With a hoarse cry that was a blend of anger and fright, she seized a bundle of hard palm leaves used for sweeping the floor and swung furiously at the motionless silhouette of the cat, trying to sweep it from the room like a common pest. But Mute did not react with panic, did not hiss, and did not bolt in confusion. Instead, with a grace and fluidity reminiscent of a stream of dark water flowing around a river stone, she arched her supple body, allowing the sharp leaves to barely graze the air above her ears. She made a swift, nearly invisible sidestep, and a fraction of a second after the mother lowered a makeshift arm, returned to exactly the same place at the foot of the bed, settling once more in an identical sphinx-like pose. This dance of avoidance and unyielding return repeated many times over, creating a surrealistic choreography of human helplessness and animal determination, until at last the exhausted, tear-streaked woman collapsed, sinking to the rough.
When the stifling, starless night finally descended, and the only faint source of light in the room was a small clay oil lamp fired in the kiln, producing more clinging smoke than brightness, Mute's eyes became the absolute hypnotic center of the entire space. In this almost total darkness, where the outlines of objects dissolved at a distance of barely an arm's length, only her slit pupils, dilated to their maximum in the light-starved environment, gathered and reflected even the most infinitesimal photons, creating the uncanny illusion that those green, vertical slivers of reflected light were self-luminous, a pair of living emeralds set deep in the encompassing black, pulsing with a rhythmic, barely perceptible inner glow that was impossible to ignore or turn away from. For Khepri, huddled in the corner and watching his grandfather's labored breathing, this silent, luminous presence in the darkness carried a significance that his reason could not fully grasp, but his bones felt instinctively. The cat had not moved from her place since appearing at the threshold, and this rigid, unwavering loyalty to the sight of the dying man seemed to suggest a force of will utterly alien to the casual, fleeting nature he had always attributed to this animal. Outside the hut, the desert night breathed with its usual cold brutality, and the distant howling of jackals, predators of the threshold between the living and the dead in Egyptian mythology, created a dreamlike, slightly delirious backdrop for this intimate vigil. The air in the room had grown almost impossibly heavy, as though it were being slowly compressed by invisible hands, and every breath, both the ragged, bubbling exhalations of the dying old man and the quick, shallow breaths of the watching grandson, hung in the air for a moment before dissolving in the dark, as if time itself were thickening, slowing, preparing for something of irreversible consequence.
The old man himself, imprisoned in the tight, aching cage of his own swiftly failing body, drifted helplessly on the blurred boundary between two worlds, where waking reality blended in a continuous, chaotic world with the vivid imagery of fever dreams. At certain moments, his eyes, glazed and distant, would fix on some point in the middle air above the palate with an expression of deep, tranquil recognition, as though the invisible veil between what was and what lay ahead had thinned to near transparency. At others, he seemed to attempt to speak, his cracked, parched lips moving soundlessly in the effort to form words whose meaning remained locked on the far side of mortal articulation. Khepri, watching this slow dissolution of a man he had known as unshakable, felt a grief as yet unprocessed, a grief not of loss, but of imminent loss, the grief of anticipation, which is in some ways far more devastating than the grief of the fact. And in the midst of all this, the labored breath, the creaking silence, the cold draft sneaking through the gaps in the mud-brick wall, Mute remained absolutely still. She had not eaten, had not slept, had not for a single moment abandoned her chosen position at the foot of the dying man's pallet. Her stillness was not the stillness of exhaustion or indifference. It was the stillness of profound, purposeful attention, the kind that precedes action of immense consequence.
As the hours of the night wore on, and the oil in the lamp ran ever lower, casting weaker and weaker light over the room, the cat's silhouette against the darkness seemed to grow somehow more substantial, more defined, as though she were slowly becoming the most real thing in a room where reality was losing its grip on all other things.
As the merciless hours of the night passed one by one, Khepri's primal animal fear, heavily stoked by folk beliefs and terrifying stories heard around campfires about the power of demons that haunted the threshold between life and death, began to give way to something subtler and more complex, a deep, almost reverent fascination with the inexplicable behavior of this small predator, who had, by her own inscrutable choice, appointed herself guardian of his grandfather's final passage. He began, for the first time in his life, to see in the cat not merely a useful tool for keeping the granaries free of rodents, but a being possessed of some incomprehensible access to dimensions of reality that his own senses could not perceive. He remembered the old stories, whispered by the most ancient women of the settlement on moonlit nights, about how the Miu could see not only in the physical dark of the Egyptian night, but in a deeper darkness, a metaphysical one, the darkness that lay on the other side of the last breath, and that their presence at the moment of a soul's departure was not accidental, but constituted a form of escort, a biological compass orienting the departing spirit toward the correct current in the vast river of the afterlife. Whether this was truth or the fevered product of a mind exhausted by grief and sleeplessness, Khepri could not say with certainty, but he knew with the absolute conviction of lived experience that something was happening in this room that transcended the simple instincts of an animal and existed in some space between the known and the unknowable, the visible and the invisible, life and whatever lay beyond it.
Chapter 4. The Sacred Threshold. The pre-dawn hours in the Nile Valley always carried a peculiar, almost palpable heaviness, a cool density of air that seemed to hold time suspended between two worlds. And in the small clay brick chamber where an old man had breathed his last before the stars began to pale, that peculiar pre-dawn stillness had taken on a weight unlike any Khepri had ever known. Mute was still there, had been there through all the long hours of the night, had not moved, had not eaten, had not for even a moment abandoned the vigil she had appointed herself to keep. But now, as the first grey intimations of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the eastern wall, her posture changed. The rigid attentiveness of the night gave way to something slower and more deliberate. She rose from her sphinx-like crouch, stretched with that total, boneless luxury that only cats possess, then walked with measured and unhurried steps to the head of the pallet. She did not look at Khepri. She did not look at the weeping women crowded near the doorway. Her eyes, still wide and deep in the dim pre-dawn light, were directed at the face of the dead man, and she remained there for a long moment, not sniffing, not touching, simply being present in some mode of attention that the watching farmer could not name or categorize, but felt resonate in his chest with the force of a distant drum. Then she turned, walked to the doorway, passed between the feet of the women without disturbing them, and disappeared into the grey pre-dawn light of the settlement, vanishing as silently and completely as she had arrived the evening before. The last guardian had concluded her watch, the old man's soul had crossed over, and the living were left behind, in a world subtly but irrevocably changed by what the night had contained. When Mute's shadow finally vanished into the corridor, and in the chamber there remained only Khepri, the motionless body of his grandfather, and the dancing motes of dust in the sunlight, the boy felt as though an enormous weight of oppressive grief, which had been pressing down on the room through all the long hours of the vigil, had lifted slightly, not disappeared, but shifted, redistributed itself somehow, as though the cat's departure had opened a valve through which something that had grown too heavy to bear could finally, slowly begin to escape. He sat for a long time in the silence, listening to the sounds of the settlement waking outside, the first bleating of goats, the distant voices of women at the river, the crying of an infant somewhere in the maze of mud-brick walls. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a world that continued turning, even as this small room held its breath around the still form on the pallet. He thought about Mute, about where she had gone, about what she had known or sensed that none of the humans in the room had been able to perceive. He thought about the way she had looked at the dead man's face in that last, long moment before departing, not with curiosity, not with the predatory assessment she might turn on a mouse, but with something that in a human face he would have called a form of acknowledgement. He did not know what to make of it. He was a farmer's son in a pre-dynastic village, not a priest or a philosopher. But he knew that what he had witnessed through the long hours of that night had altered something in the way he understood the world, had drawn a line between before and after that he would carry within him for the rest of his life, as real and indelible as any scar.
Chapter 5. Whispers and Libations. The golden hour in the Nile Valley was not merely a time of day, but a physical state of concentration in which the air thickened with heat and sand particles, turning every breath into the taste of roasted earth and ancient stone dust. In this dense amber light, which the Greek travelers who would arrive centuries later would struggle to describe in their northern languages, the village of Kepris clan existed at the precise, precarious boundary between the living world and the world of memory, between what was built and what the desert was constantly, patiently dismantling. Khepri moved through this golden thickness toward the edge of the settlement, where the cultivated land gave way abruptly to the clean hostility of the desert, and where the boundary between the human and the non-human was felt most acutely. He carried with him a small clay pot of water, still cool from the shade of the storage room, and a handful of dried fish, offerings not to any god, but to the borderland itself, to the idea that the edge of safety was worth acknowledging with something more than passive reliance. He had learned this from his father, who had learned it from his, in the way that all true knowledge in this age was transmitted, not through any written text, but through the living body of habit, the kind of habit that only makes sense when you have already understood in your bones what it means to stand at the edge of survival and look outward at the vast indifference of the world.
Chapter 6. Papyrus Scribe.
The golden hour of the Egyptian sun poured through the narrow, high-set window of dried brick, cutting the half-dark of the chamber with an almost physically tangible sheaf of thick, honeyed light. In this luminous column, the motes of 1,000 years of dust danced their slow, eternal dance, indifferent to the grief and the living and the dead that had lately inhabited this room. Khepri sat by the window and let the light fall across his hands, the hands of a farmer, roughened and dark, bearing in every callus and crack the record of everything he had ever done to keep his family alive. He was trying to understand something. He could feel it at the edge of his thinking, the thing he was trying to understand. But each time he reached for it directly, it dissolved, the way the shapes in the water-warped reflections on the river dissolved when you tried to look at them straight. It had to do with Mute. It had to do with what she had done, and what her doing it had meant, and what it might mean for how he understood the world going forward. He knew, in the practical, unsentimental way that a man who works land knows things, that what Mute did, hunting rats, driving off snakes, sitting through the night with the dying, served functions he could enumerate and explain. And yet there was something about the sum of it that seemed larger than its parts, something that his practical mind kept circling but could not quite land on,
like a hawk riding thermals that kept shifting beneath it.
Chapter 7. A Goddess Awakens. The grand temple complex of Bastet, known to the sprawling, sun-baked world as Bastet, stood as a monumental testament to the old ways, its colossal sandstone pillars thrusting upward into the suffocating, heavy heat of the Nile Delta afternoon. The golden hour, a sacred threshold of time where the fierce, blinding dominion of Ra began to yield to the encroaching velvet mysteries of the night, descended upon the city like a physical weight. Shafts of luminous ochre light pierced through the massive hypostyle hall, illuminating billions of dust motes that danced and swirled in the stagnant air, creating a tangible, almost ethereal atmosphere of profound antiquity. Here, in the deepest sanctuaries, where the scent of heavy myrrh and the copper tang of ancient blood sacrifices still lingered in the porous rock, the old goddess resided. She was Bastet, the fierce lioness, the bloodthirsty protector, a lesser echo of the terrifying Sekhmet. But the winds traversing the sprawling papyrus marshes of the delta carried a subtle, undeniable change, a whispering current of shifting paradigms and evolving anxieties. The people, battered by the chaotic uncertainties of mortal life and deeply terrified by the labyrinthine, shadow-draped perils of the duat, the perilous journey of the soul after death, required something more than a distant, roaring warrior. They required intimacy. They required a guardian who sat by their hearth, a silent sentinel who watched the dark corners of their mud-brick homes. The high priest Passer, a man whose skin was as weathered and textured as the ancient papyrus scrolls he so meticulously studied, stood amidst the encroaching shadows of the colossal lioness statues. He felt the cold, unyielding nature of the stone beneath his calloused fingertips, recognizing with a chilling clarity that the old iconography was losing its vital, pulsating grip on the hearts of the populace. The martial ferocity of the lioness, while necessary for the preservation of Ma'at against the cosmic serpent of chaos, offered little comfort to the grieving mother or the dying elder. The religious landscape was fracturing, splintering into countless local, unorganized superstitions centered around the small, enigmatic felines that inhabited their granaries and alleys. Passer, possessing a mind as sharp and strategic as a freshly napped flint knife, understood that to save the cult of Bastet from slipping into the dusty oblivion of forgotten deities, the goddess herself had to evolve. She had to awaken from her blood-soaked, feral slumber and step into the intimate domestic light of the hearth fires. The consolidation of these scattered, desperate beliefs into a unified, towering theological structure was not merely a matter of religious duty, it was an unprecedented opportunity to elevate Bastet into the absolute epicenter of a new, profound spiritual empire, one built not on fear, but on the enduring mystical promise of eternal protection. Deep within the cavernous archives of the temple, illuminated only by the frantic, flickering glow of castor oil lamps, a younger priest named Amenemhat sat hunched over a heavy wooden table, his long, delicate fingers carefully unrolling a fragile papyrus scroll. The rough, fibrous texture of the reeds rustled softly in the oppressive silence, a sound akin to dry leaves scattered by a desert wind. This document was the culmination of years of meticulous observation, an exhaustive compilation of the accounts and tales documented by the wandering scribe Khepri and numerous others who had traversed the length of the mighty Nile. Amenemhat's eyes, lined with thick bands of dark kohl to ward off the evil eye and the harsh glare of the sun, scanned the intricate hieratic script. The ink, made from soot and natural gums, detailed extraordinary phenomena occurring not in grand temples or upon bloody battlefields, but in the humble mud-brick dwellings of common farmers and artisans. Khepri's writings.
Chapter 8.
The Science of Soul and Scent.
This chapter represents a deliberate, almost brutally aesthetic break in the previously chronologically ordered historical narrative, transporting the viewer from the stuffy, incense and myrrh-scented granary chambers of pre-dynastic Egypt straight into the heart of the New Kingdom, to the very epicenter of Egyptian civilization, at the absolute zenith of its power, sophistication, and divine self-confidence. The visual style shifts dramatically and intentionally. The rough, earthy textures of the pre-dynastic world, dominated by the muted palette of unglazed clay and desert dust, give way to an almost overwhelming explosion of saturated color, monumental scale, and the oppressive grandeur of a civilization that had learned to write its aspirations directly into stone and gold. We are now in the reign of Ramesses the Great, the world's most powerful monarch, the living embodiment of the sun god Ra on earth, a man whose ego was large enough to carve his own image into the living rock of the Nile cliffs, and whose armies had fought the Hittites to a standstill at Kadesh. The camera, in a slow, majestic aerial shot deliberately reminiscent of the great David Lean epics, descends from a sky so intensely blue it seems almost artificially saturated, toward the avenue of ram-headed sphinxes leading to the entrance pylon of the great temple at Karnak, where every stone surface blazes with freshly painted hieroglyphs in cinnabar red, lapis lazuli blue, malachite green, and gold leaf, creating a visual cacophony of sacred power that is both magnificent and, in its sheer excess, faintly overwhelming.
Chapter 9. The City of the Cat.
The sun, descending toward the western horizon, flooded the Nile Delta with liquid gold, transforming the landscape into a mystical vision from the deepest of dreams, where the boundary between the world of mortals and the domain of the gods seemed thin as linen in the late light. The great river, caught in this hour between the two states of its daily life, the broad, busy highway of midday commerce and the mysterious, silent road of night, moved with a particular heavy beauty, its surface broken into 10,000 golden scales by the light breeze off the marshes, each scale briefly and perfectly reflecting the sinking sun before dissolving back into the general shimmer. Along the banks, the rhythms of life were shifting into their evening register, the fishermen drawing in their nets for the last time, the women filling their water jars before the cool settled in, the children splashing in the shallows with the careless urgency of those who know that dusk will bring a summons indoors. And above it all, at the edge of the cultivated land where the rich black earth of the floodplain met the pale gold of the desert, the great necropolis of the West Bank glowed in the horizontal light, its limestone cliffs and hidden tomb entrances catching the sun at an angle that made them seem, for this one brief daily moment, almost incandescent, as though the dead themselves were lit from within, briefly illuminated, briefly visible, before the sun withdrew and the long night of eternity reclaimed them.
Chapter 10. A Million Sacred Mummies.
The sun tilted toward the west above the vast horizon of Bubastis, bathing the monumental sandstone walls of the temple in the thick, almost tangible light of the golden hour. The rays filtered through the heat haze rising off the desert beyond the city's edge, fell on the temple precinct at an angle that transformed its surfaces into something between a painting and a vision. The relief carvings of the goddess Bastet, cat-headed and serene, seemed to shimmer with an inner life, as though the stone itself were breathing slowly in the warmth. Below the temple walls, in the long colonnaded enclosures that stretched along the sacred lake, the cats moved, hundreds of them, perhaps more,
No one had counted them in years because they arrived and they bred and they died, and their bodies were wrapped in linen and placed in the sacred catacombs beneath the temple, and new ones took their place, an endless cycle of feline life and death that had been operating within these walls for generations. They were not domesticated in any ordinary sense. They were consecrated, which is a different thing. They moved through the temple precinct with a liberty that no other creature, including the priests, quite possessed, entering the inner sanctuaries without permission, sleeping in the laps of the sacred women, walking along the tops of the altar screens with the complete indifference of beings who understood that this entire elaborate human construction existed primarily for their benefit and were mildly amused by the energy invested in maintaining the illusion that it served any other purpose.
Chapter 11. The Pharaoh's Guardian.
The golden hour above the Nile Valley was never merely an astronomical phenomenon. For the inhabitants of ancient Egypt, it constituted tangible proof that the sun god Ra, in all his majestic glory, was concluding his daily journey across the sky and preparing his passage through the underworld, from which he would return, reborn and powerful, with the next dawn. In this hour, the world seemed to pause at the threshold between the sacred and the ordinary, and for those who worked in the temple of Bastet, that threshold had particular significance. The evening rituals were the most elaborate of the day's 3 cycles, the ones that required the greatest precision and the greatest attentiveness, because in the mind of the theology that governed their lives, the welfare of the sun in its journey through the darkness depended in part on the correctness of what was done here, in this courtyard, in these hours. The head priest moved through the ritual gestures with the automatic certainty of someone who had performed them so many times that they had become a form of muscle memory rather than conscious action. The burning of the Kefi incense, the anointing of the cat goddess statue with sacred oils, the recitation of the evening hymn in a low, resonant chant that the assembled cats, curled on their cushioned platforms or prowling the outer edges of the lamplight, regarded with complete, transcendent indifference.
Chapter 12. The Fire of Pelusium.
The year 525 BCE inscribed itself in the annals of history as the time when the ancient splendor of Egypt, already smoldering with the last remnants of former power, was destined to face the irresistible tide of a rising empire, the Persian armies of Cambyses II. Moving with the relentless, mechanical precision of a force that had already swallowed whole civilizations, were converging on the eastern delta fortress of Pelusium, the key to Egypt that no invader had yet managed to turn. The Persian commander was a man who understood not merely the logistics of war, but its deepest psychology. And at Pelusium, he demonstrated this understanding with an act of strategic genius that was simultaneously an act of almost incomprehensible cultural desecration. He ordered his soldiers to round up every cat they could find in the delta towns and villages, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, and carry them to the front ranks of the advancing Persian army. And there, painted on the shields of the infantry and carried in the arms of soldiers who advanced openly, in full view of the Egyptian garrison on the walls of Pelusium, these sacred, inviolable animals served as the most devastating weapon Cambyses had, the certainty that any Egyptian archer who loosed an arrow into the Persian ranks risked killing a living embodiment of the goddess Bastet, and thereby condemned his own soul to an eternity of divine wrath. The Egyptian garrison held their bows. The Persians walked through.
Chapter 13. Echoes in a Christian World.
The golden hour of the Egyptian dusk spreads across the vast sandy landscape, bathing the world in the deep, saturated shades of ochre, terracotta, and raw gold, while the religious landscape of Egypt undergoes its own slow, tectonic transformation, invisible, gradual, and as irreversible as the slow grinding of the desert against the stone. By the time the Ptolemaic dynasty has taken hold, the cat has traveled so far from Khepri's pragmatic granary sentinel that the two seem barely connected. Bastet is now a major goddess of the Egyptian pantheon, her temples numerous and wealthy, her festivals drawing pilgrims from across the delta and beyond, her sacred cats maintained in elaborate, subsidized comfort by priestly establishments whose complexity and wealth would astonish anyone from the pre-dynastic villages where the whole story began. The camera moves slowly through the ruins of Bubastis, what remains of it, the shattered columns and the worn relief carvings, as the narration traces this transformation, how a useful animal became a revered animal, how reverence became theology, how theology became institution, and how institution, as it always eventually does, calcified into something that forgot its own origins.
Chapter 14. Unearthing the Gods. The 19th century and the early years of the 20th brought with them an unprecedented, almost feverish era in the history of human knowledge known broadly as Egyptomania, which would permanently alter the way the Western world understood itself in relation to the ancient civilizations of the Nile. It began, in a sense, with Bonaparte's expedition of 1798, not a conquest, but an intellectual raid, the moment when Europe first encountered the full, vertiginous depth of Egyptian civilization and found itself simultaneously awed and acquisitive, wanting simultaneously to understand and to possess. The scholars who accompanied that expedition and the generations of archaeologists, philologists, and museum curators who followed them over the next century brought back not merely objects, but a new understanding of time itself, the dawning, deeply unsettling recognition that what Europeans had casually called the ancient world was, by Egyptian standards, almost embarrassingly recent, that the civilization of the pharaohs had been building and recording and burying its dead for millennia before Rome was a village and Greece was an idea. The camera moves through the galleries of the great European museums, the Louvre, the British Museum, the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, where the artifacts of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization stand in climate-controlled cases, watched over by security guards and school groups, far from the sun and sand and the sacred cats that once moved through the temple precincts of a living religion.
Chapter 15. The Modern Oracle.
The story, like the Nile itself overflowing each year with its inexorable seasonal certainty, returns at last to where it began, not in the gleaming laboratories of modern veterinary science, not in the theoretical frameworks of evolutionary biology, not in the grand museums where mummified cats lie in their linen wrappings behind glass, but in the ordinary, unremarkable daily reality of a human being and a cat existing together in shared space, negotiating the ancient, wordless terms of an arrangement that has survived 10,000 years of history, revolution, and change with remarkable fidelity to its original structure. The cat that sits on the keyboard while its owner tries to work, that yowls for food at 5 in the morning with complete indifference to the concept of weekends, that brings dead mice to the doorstep as offerings and regards the recipient's horror with serene incomprehension. This cat is doing exactly what Mute did in the Granary at the edge of the pre-dynastic desert. The form has changed, the substance has not. What we call a pet, the ancient Egyptians called a guardian. What we call affection, the biological record calls mutual benefit. What we call mystery, the uncanny intuition, the strange prescience, the behavior at the bedside of the dying that no one has quite been able to explain away, is perhaps the last visible trace of something that has been with us longer than civilization, something that chose us as much as we chose it, something that found in the proximity of the human world not servitude, but the best hunting ground, the most reliable granary, the most densely inhabited edge.